Hello, everybody, and speakers. You can all join me in video here. Welcome to the first roundtable Techonomies hosted in some time. So we're really happy to be back with you in this new year in a very cold New York area, myself anyway. Here to talk about cybersecurity, one of the central issues, technology issues facing business right now. It is really vexing, and we have super experts here to talk about what companies need to know, how businesses need to think differently about the cybersecurity challenge, and the new ways that cybersecurity can be handled. So the session title is How the New Approach to Cybersecurity Can Create Trust. So trust is a big part of the discussion, but new approaches, and particularly automation, will be a big part of what we're here to talk about. So let me just quickly, first of all, thank Wipro for partnering with Techonomy for this session. And I'll introduce Wipro's Tony Buffamonte, who's the Global Head of Cybersecurity and Risk Services at Wipro. So we're very pleased that he was able to join us, a super veteran security expert. In addition, we have Elena Kvachko, who is with SAP, where she is the new title of Chief Trust Officer, which is a super interesting development. And we're going to ask her to explain what that means and why SAP has a Chief Trust Officer. And finally, Mike Kaiser, who's Head of Strategy at Sailpoint, which is a partner with Wipro and a company that uses automation to assist with security, particularly around identity. And we'll ask Mike to explain in specific how that works. Let me also just thank Kendall Wyckoff, who is our DJ and moderator in the background here. So, well, let's, I'm not going to say much to start, except that, there have been so many shocking cybersecurity disasters in recent years. I mean, the one that really stands out most to me is the SolarWinds thing, where an entire system that was used widely across government and business was infected for an unknown period. And the reason that one strikes me as so scary is, from what I understand, even to this day, it's not clear that all of the harm has been remedied from that in so many different organizations. Then, of course, we have prominent things like the Colonial Pipeline hack, when that was just shut down, the Log4j problem, which maybe some of our experts here can explain better than me. But there's so many things that it's like almost no week passes without some kind of new breach. We live in a completely digital society. We have unfortunately not created the protections we need for that society. And it does go back to some extent to the reality that the internet, when it was invented and designed, was not designed to really be secure. So with that brief introduction, let me first go to you, Tony, and ask you to just talk a little bit about the landscape and what threats you see as most severe and why this landscape is changing so quickly.
It's a great question, David, and welcome to all of our my esteemed panelists and guests that are listening in today. And I think it's so interesting, right? I mean, we've all lived in this very different world for the last couple of years, and so it's very obvious that the threat landscape has changed, strictly because of the way our working has changed over the past couple of years. And so you've got this expansive new reach of at-home users and workers that are trying to be productive in their day-to-day lives. But so I think, let's put that one aside just for a second, because I think that one's known to everybody. I think what's very interesting that what we're seeing today, when our cybersecurists are combing the dark web and they're looking at all the threat intel data and working with our clients each and every day in our security operations centers, what you see today is an incredibly advanced threat that is using the same automation, if not maybe more automation, as the good guys are, right? So when you think about uncovering vulnerabilities like Log4j utilities, right? The amount of information sharing that we see in the hacker community, the amount of crowdsourcing that happens, the amount of automation that is put to bear on trying to determine how do I exploit that and monetize that is absolutely incredible. And so So this ecosystem continues to get more and more mature, continues to get more advanced with the automation tools that we're all becoming used to. And I think when you take the landscape getting broader from organizations and how they work and how they're transforming into their new digital world, and then you take this increased threat and automation that the attackers are using, it's a bit of a recipe for disaster, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's always been something of an arms race, but you're saying it's a little more even maybe than it used to be. So quickly before we move to Elena, who is Chief Trust Officer at SAP, why do we use this word trust more now than before? And when Wipro thinks about trust, why is that key, and why did we decide to make this the title of the session?
Well, I'll tell you, we've talked about at-home workers and shifting, the way that they transact business within organizations, but really let's think about the end consumer. I mean, businesses today are rapidly trying to evolve their practices. They're trying to automate their own front office and middle office in particular, trying to get closer with their customers. They're trying to personalize that experience in a new and different way as ever before. And the customers, their ability to consume that has a lot to do with efficiency, right? It has a lot to do with the user experience, but also has to do with a lot with security and privacy, right? And so if I'm going to allow myself to accept the benefits of all of this personalization and automation and geotagging and everything that comes along with it, I've also have to put a little bit of trust, if not a lot of trust, in the hands of the organizations that are collecting my personal data every second, right? And so those organizations that not only manage that from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a policies, procedures, and a brand standpoint, are really the ones that are excelling in the new age, as they're not only evolving what their business processes are, but they're also making sure that their customers are comfortable at the same time. And that's given them a competitive advantage in the new way of transacting business.
Right. So if we live in a increasingly digital society, an increasingly completely digital society, digital economy and marketplace, every company is at risk if their customers don't trust that they've got a handle on this issue, which I think is just the kind of thing that Elena talks to many of SAP's partners about and customers. So Elena, tell us about your role and how SAP thinks about trust.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. We established at SAP the first trust office, and we're building an incredible team that's tackling different matters and aspects of trust. So for us, trust is a confidence that the commitments will be kept. It's a business value for us. What it comes down to, in practice, we're also building almost like a one-stop shop for our customers for all matters security, privacy, and compliance. And this one-stop shop is a place where our customers can get critical information on how their most important and critical data and workflows are being protected. SAP's mission is to help our customers run their business better and improve lives by securing the intelligent enterprise. And of course, through that value of trust, we're committed to providing that robust security for all of our customers. We do believe in over communicating with customers, providing them with all of the information they need to make informed decisions about security, and we make that information available to them. Just to give you some of the examples, what we're being asked to provide and what we do share are our security policies, tools, other aspects of SAP Global Security. And we have also dedicated one-on-one support available by request, through which we provide this more personalized touch and experience for the customers and partners. What we do see, David, is that as the threat landscape evolves, as the technology evolves, as the digital landscape evolves, a lot of companies, they do seek to differentiate on trust and transparency, in addition to just the quality of products or services that they provide. And of course, to increase that scope and to increase the strategic responsibilities as this organizational catalyst and those transformations and those trends, we built the chief trust office. And what we do through our global team that's now located in multiple countries and really working very hard is we're providing dedicated support to strengthening that trust with customers. We provide them seamless communication, as much transparency as possible, and really hoping to shape that global security narrative that will help them make important decisions about their own infrastructure and services.
So do you think that in addition to companies being worried about being, hacked and just losing data or losing capabilities, that they are increasingly aware that it's as much about perception as reality? Do you find that most companies now appreciate that if their customers don't trust that they can manage the data, which of course they hold about their customers, that they might be less attractive as a supplier to those customers?
Yes, David, so there are multiple surveys that come out at different times of the year that measure that level of trust. But what we do see is that the customers that invest and that put emphasis on security, on privacy, on compliance, and really communicate and share that with them are really, usually at the top of that list. And I think this is what we're striving to do and what we think, other companies in the industry should definitely be putting on top of their roadmap.
It's great. And well, but it strikes me that among the companies that have had major data breaches are Facebook, LinkedIn, Google. So if those companies can get screwed, it really means it's a risk for everybody. So Mike, bring Sailpoint into this discussion. Tell us what Sailpoint does, first of all, exactly, and how you think about trust and the changing nature of the security landscape.
Sure, David. Really what we view at Sailpoint is that this trust is undergirded by identity, right? We've seen over the past couple of years how that has become more and more true, like being able to identify who you're interacting with and making sure they have the right access and minimizing that footprint is essential, right? The analogy I like to make that we've seen over the last few years is that identity is on a similar narrative trajectory as trust as well, as the color blue. In ancient world, it had not much of a significance or a prominence, but over the centuries, it rose to become the world's most popular color, right? And identity is kind of on the same trajectory. People are realizing it's kind of the key to trust and to conducting this digital business. Look at working from home that Tony mentioned before, right? If you worked from home, you were using your digital identity, and you were more likely to be in an affluent, well-spoken area or industry. You have better outcomes for your kids. So all of this trust, it's more than just trust in conducting business. It has real side effects for our workers, for our customers. And so we at Sailpoint realize that identity is having a moment, and we try and support our clients and people we work with to use identity in ways that embrace the fact that it's ubiquitous, that it has to be kind of automatic or a default choice at the very least, and then basically making it easy to use because people have a business to conduct, and it's not, as you kind of pointed out, it's not primarily identity. It's just an undergirding of what they're already trying to accomplish.
So you're not really about logging in, you're about managing and monitoring who is who the entire time your systems are in operation, knowing the identity of everyone inside the software architecture of a business. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, and I would actually argue that people who are serious about security are doing the same thing, right? And they always have. It's just become more prominent now. We at Speed and Scale try and establish a policy that people can use to make sure they know who people are, but enforce the right policies and the right identity context to make the right decisions, right? And so it's an increasingly complex environment that requires some new tooling to achieve it at what I said, speed and scale.
Okay, well, if one of the themes of this discussion today is that automation is much more than in the past a critical part of how cybersecurity defenses are maintained, how does Sailpoint use automation?
Great question. Part of it, believe it or not, is just straight up automating formerly manual processes. There's a whole spectrum of where people are. Some people are using spreadsheets from the 1990s, 2000s. Others are already have some automated business logic or process. But I think the real future is in understanding what's come before and building on that and getting insight from past decisions, past information, past identity context and current identity context, and then applying it in key ways. Now, people would describe this as machine learning or artificial intelligence. And Tony and I were talking about this before the panel and how it's a suspect term already. But what you try and do is use it in very constructed, specific use cases in applied ways, not using machine learning or new technology for technology's sake. But like I said, to make things easy to use. If we can go ahead and inform people who are using our solutions that, hey, you should probably decline this access, or this person should probably have this access to do their job better, we can do that in partnership with human learning as well.
Right. Okay, good. I'm seeing we're already getting some great questions. So we will get to audience questions before too long, because several good ones have already come in, both in the Q&A and in the chat. In general, probably it's better to put them in the Q&A if somebody has a question, but I saw one from John Madison I'll get to also, which I think is especially for Mike in a little while. Tony, just step back for a minute and just talk about the threats for a second. I mean, what do you see and what does Wipro see as the biggest threats, and particularly the biggest new threats?
I think, again, we talked about this pace of change, right? Businesses changing, adopting SaaS, adopting cloud technologies. You have a lot of situations where the IT spend has really moved out of the IT environment and moved into the business, and the business going ahead and contracting directly on some of these scenarios that may or may not be done in the most safe and secure manner from a security architecture perspective is from the get-go, and that's a major issue. Clearly, as we continue to evolve this threat landscape, like I already talked about, third parties, the supply chain continues to be, I think, one of the most critical and important things that we need to address. So I think those for me are a couple key ones, but I think the root cause, I think, of some of the activities that we're seeing today, or at least the lack of an organization's ability to deal with some of these threats, whether they be through adopting emerging technologies, or they be with managing third parties and the like, is the fact that in some cases we're still seeing old school, what I would consider old school risk assessments occurring, right? And so where you would do a sort of a NIST maturity assessment, for example, or a CMM 1 through 5 type of scale via some consulting engagement that would go do some interviews and come out with some sort of report that tells you you're a little bit ahead of your peers, but not quite world class, and so on and so forth. And I think anybody that's doing a pen and paper risk assessment or consulting engagement like that, you're recognizing it's one of the services that we provide. I think you're missing the boat, right? I think there's just too much ability today to get more real-time information about what's actually happening in a client's environment, whether that be threat intel information, user behavior data, system configuration. We talked about identity and monitoring, things that Mike was describing. There is too much of that today that we can absorb and analyze in a more real-time basis to be able to quicker identify these types of threats, no matter what the vector is. And I think that's the key lesson, I think, for organizations, is they're not seeing all of the vectors and the ability of these things until it's too late.
So it's interesting when you're not so much worried as much about new kinds of malware as basically managerial error that companies engage in that creates greater vulnerability. But so the real-time monitoring and state-of-the-art automation, just talk a little bit about some of the other ways, maybe beside identity, that you see that happening. And then I want to go to Elena and ask her how SAP thinks about automation and security and trust.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's always going to be a new version of malware, right? I mean, there's always going to be a new vulnerability. Log4j was a great example of that, right? It's an organization's ability to identify the scope of what the problem may be, analyze their environment, and be able to have a closed loop process that actually remediates and patches those types of things. And we see that done incredibly manually in a number of organizations today. And which is some of the reasons that you cited earlier about SolarWinds and some others, where you still have open holes associated with it. So I'm seeing a couple of really interesting automations to get to your question around things like, I mentioned third-party risk, right? I mean, the days of doing a questionnaire and analyzing a third party are well past us, right? The days, I would argue, of even getting an external service third party that actually gives us a score on a vendor, which just looks at them from the outside in, are past us. I mean, what we are seeing and doing today is actually creating automation that's pulling configuration information from inside a third party across the firewall and into the organization to be able to analyze that in a more real world basis, as opposed to just an outside in view. I'd say that's one. And I'd say it certainly, we've been seeing automation evaluating different controls, whether those cloud controls or broader infrastructure level controls, much more real time than we have seen in the past. And that also goes along with vulnerability as well. I mentioned vulnerability, but I mean, again, what we used to do is we used to see, go do a scan, go do a discovery, go do a scan, go prioritize a vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities, go determine how do I go fix it, right? And then remediate it and track it. And those are all either manual processes or varying different silos of processes, technologies, and organizations. And we're seeing new tools and technologies bring all that together from a platform perspective and be able to actually drive value in some of those programs, and not to mention some of the costs down as well.
That's interesting. So in partnering, companies are making letting a security assessment go inside the partner systems, a criteria for even establishing a new partnership. That's pretty amazing. So Elena, I mean, that's very close to a lot of things SAP is deeply involved in, because you guys are super involved in how companies connect to one another, et cetera. So talk about how automation plays in your world.
Of course, thank you, David. You asked earlier, where do we draw the line between what's managerial and what's technical? And I've always believed in this holistic approach to security. So we have to look at different angles. We have to look at all the multiple channels through which an attacker can enter an organization. Of course, as an attacker, they don't care which avenue to use as long as they achieve the goal, right? And we as defenders have to make sure that we're prepared for that. Therefore, we do believe in this holistic approach. Of course, there's a lot of data that's now available that shows the increasing cost of every breach. And I think the last numbers that I saw show that the cost of a data breach last year increased to 4.24 million, which again underscores the importance for every organization to secure their networks and to secure their data. A critical part for that would be a real-time monitoring of systems, and where automation would be a crucial part and a crucial enabler. We do definitely rely on a lot of those tooling and technologies that are capable of analyzing millions of data sets, tracking different cyber threats, while also be able to learn and improve every day. We see that those philosophies of zero trust and shift left are becoming more and more popular in the industry. And of course, some of the advantages that of the systems that Tony described and we discussed here include new capabilities of detecting those new threats at a pace that traditional software systems couldn't keep up with. What I think is of particular interest for me, and where I'm looking for all of the great ideas together with my team, is how can we, and if it's possible, how can we automate trust, and how can we deliver trust at scale? And we definitely have deployed new tooling, new experimental and pilot projects to deliver that. We're also looking for ways, where customers can self-service themselves, just given the volume of, that needs to be processed. We want to make sure to be available for everyone. So definitely providing those self-services opportunities are a core part of our focus. We're looking for opportunities for our internal teams to also self-service themselves and to be able to find that information quicker so that they can process multiple requests that we're receiving much faster. If we go back to trust, I believe that the notion of trust is comprised of privacy, security, convenience, but also speed to market. So speed to market is very very important. And therefore, we're very much looking for those ways which can allow us to deliver that at a faster scale. And I think, as I said, those companies that prioritize security and privacy and over communicate with customers, we see them typically go on top of that trust rank and trust lists. And this is what we're striving to do.
Great, thanks. Okay, there's two sort of fundamental categories of things I want to talk about quickly before I go to all the great questions, although I will address one now. We're not going to auction off my shirt, even though I acknowledge it's a nice shirt. And thank you to Riza for that question. So the two categories are, one, the sort of changing landscape of people right now. It's so hard to get good people. And here we're talking about security is harder than ever. Yes, automation is great, and it's, doesn't require as many people if it's done right, one would hope. But also you need people to put it in, you need to work with the people. And then separately, we're in this weird pandemic time. That's clearly changed the threat landscape. And Mike, I want you to pick up on any of this if you can. But then the other category I want to make sure I get to before going to a bunch of great questions that we're getting is how managements and boards of directors are thinking about these issues. So Mike, first of all, on the people side, what would you say about, what's going on and how the software industry and the cybersecurity, ecosystem can respond and companies can respond?
Sure. I think it's long been a challenge, retaining and hiring top talent that are qualified. I think that with the bring your own environment and the work from home movement, it's actually exacerbated the problem a bit now, because I don't have to be geolocated to find potential talent, right? At the same time, I think that what you do is you look in places that you didn't expect to find them before. I was on a panel this past year with a set of individuals that were, in theory, not qualified to be part of the security industry. And really, people assume there's some kind of qualification or some kind of certification or set of required degrees or credentials, and that's not always the case. And so I've done a lot of looking into finding talent, people that are faithful, they're hungry, they're teachable, they're quick to learn, and building them up internally, right? As well as participating in industry organizations that bring a more dignity to the role and clearer career paths internal to some of these organizations. That's just my first take, but I'm sure the other panelists have thoughts as well.
Well, let's just go to this. I mean, we're already halfway through and there's so many things to discuss, but I want to ask you, Tony, about this issue of boards and top management. I mean, you were making the great point that so many tech things that we would think of formerly as the province of the IT people in a company are being, just done by departments and even senior managers, because it's all cloud. You can just do a deal with Amazon or whomever and get something done. But do you think, I mean, on the other hand, we've had all this publicity about breaches and cybersecurity risks. How do you assess the state of mind of management generally? And then how big of a priority is this for boards?
Oh, it's a huge priority for boards. There's no question about it. The conversation's definitely changed though, right? I mean, if I go back to watershed moments in cyber, you would think of, some of the breaches that occurred in prominent retailers in 2014, and the types of time periods like that. And at that time, the topic at the board was educate me on what these cyber risks are, right? And tell me, what does it mean to me? And also tell me, how do I exercise my oversight responsibilities, right? And so we've seen a massive evolution in terms of whether that be independent advisors to boards that are coming on, whether it be special committees that have been formed to specifically tackle this issue. The level of maturity around the conversation in the boardroom at most organizations across industry sectors, not all, but in most organizations, is way higher than it's ever been. Now, it's still frustrating as heck for the chairman of the board to say, like, aren't we done with this yet? I don't get it. Like, we've been spending all this money on cyber over the past several years. You guys come in here, you give me this roadmap, you tell me it's just another $5 million and we're going to be at a reasonable maturity level. And why are we still talking about this, right? So I think you still have a lot of that going on. So they get it that it's a massive business inhibitor, potentially a massive business risk. It's on par, one of the highest enterprise level risks that they're managing and monitoring. They understand their fiduciary responsibility better than they ever have been before, but I still see a level of frustration in terms of the management of it, because that arms race that you mentioned earlier, David, they feel like management isn't winning or isn't even competing, right, at the level that they should be competing to keep up with the arms race. And so I think it's going to put a pressure on CISOs or other security leaders in organizations to do a better job of demonstrating the value out of the investments that they're getting, right? Because Mike made a great point. Everyone wants to talk about, oh, we'll just go throw some AI and ML in there. We're gonna be good, right? I mean, that is not the path to success if you're communicating to a board or an audit committee or IT committee. The ability to be able to quantify what the risk level is today and tomorrow, right, and in cognizant of the evolving threat landscape is still very, very, I would say that ability is still very nascent in most organizations. And that's the frustration point. I think so many have said for so long, I feel like we should have got a handle on this now and be able to speak in my business language in terms of financial repercussions or brand damage and things like that. And it's not the majority of the conversations that you see today. You see the conversations that are less about educating what cyber is and more about this is what we're doing about it. But they need to evolve yet further to talk about here's how we're managing the investment over time. And this is the value that we're getting out of it. And just one more quick point on this, and it's broader than cyber. You know, I talked about as organizations continue to migrate to new technology environments and migrate to the cloud, you know, part of that is around speed and efficiency and effectiveness. Part of it was supposed to be about reduced cost as well. And that only happens if you dismantle the legacy environment, right? And so what's happening is you're seeing these new SaaS and cloud environments be spun up. And yet we still have some of the legacy environments, which not only have the security vulnerability, but also the cost associated with it. So where's the value, you know, that was in the business case? Well, it's eroding. And I think that those are the types of conversations and types of strategies that organizations are pivoting to so they can demonstrate the value of those cases.
Okay, I'm going to start going to some of the questions because I think they're so interesting. And I'm warning everyone who's asked a question, I may try to get you to say it. I'm going to allow you to talk. So if Jody is, I thought I'd go to Jody first because she's a part of our community who is herself a major league security expert. I don't know if you're there, Jody. If you're not, I will just ask the question you typed in, but I've just allowed you to talk. Okay, so go ahead and ask your question. And you might want to quickly just identify yourself.
Okay, Jody Westby, CEO, Global Cyber Risk. Hi, everybody. Great panel. Elena, I wanted to ask you, the Biden administration has reacted to some of the major breaches with mandatory cybersecurity requirements for portions of critical infrastructure. But on the other side of the pond, the European Commission is moving forward in a thoughtful manner with its complete digital strategy and requiring cybersecurity measures and trust within systems. And I think quite thoroughly leading from data protection all the way through platforms and the like. And so my question is, who's leading, the US or EU, and who are major companies paying more attention to?
So a question might be another way is, should the US be doing what Europe's doing too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead, Elena, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And hi, Jody. Great to hear from you again. What I would say is that governments across the world, including the US and EU, are more and more aware of the threats that can affect their constituents and the critical infrastructure alike. And we saw, as Jody mentioned, that President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity was a great first step at the federal level in the US, towards that direction and towards them being more involved in this issue. In addition to the executive order, there was also a bipartisan infrastructure infrastructure bill that is said to include cybersecurity fundings for some state and local governments to be able to protect their critical infrastructures. So what we see is that it's no longer only up to the private sector to protect our economy, which is definitely a positive trend. And what we also see is that leading companies, so Jody, you were asking who is leading companies don't view regulation as an obstacle anymore, but actually the ability to meet and exceed those requirements as a competitive advantage. Specifically to that provision that you were referring to, breaches are actually mandatory to be disclosed, through multiple laws and provisions, at the state level, GDPR, other legislations. And this is not only just a legal requirement, but we also have this as a requirement and a customer commitment in just, vendor contracts. The debate that the industry was going through in Q3, Q4 last year was actually caused by the question of the incident reporting, specifically incident reporting that are not confirmed breaches. I don't believe that provision actually made it to the final part of the order, into the final version of the order, but that was definitely the question that we were debating, how to even operationalize it. But overall, I would say, it's definitely something that we can all only tackle together, and I would say that, the leading companies, they do definitely build those provisions to be able to be ahead of such regulatory requirements.
Okay, I'm going to see if John Madison is out there, if I make him, give him a little voice here, if I can find him on the list. Where is he? John, there he is. So if you're there, John, go ahead and ask your question. Otherwise, I will ask it for you. Maybe we've lost him. Well, it was definitely something, I think, Mike, that you might want to address, because it was about identity. And see, I don't know if you can just look at it. Do you believe that self-sovereign can succeed without a centralized authority? And how would you design the interface? And anybody could read the question in the, oh no, they can't. Maybe they can. If so, how would you design the physical digital interface to establish initial identity and manage any identity theft?
Sure. Two things, self-sovereign identity, NFTs, all of this that's really getting a lot of publicity right now, it's a little bit misnamed in the sense that while, yes, it is a distributed kind of structure, you are getting credentials or you're getting an identity or a description of what your identity is from a trusted authority. Easiest example of this, if you look at, for example, Apple joining Google and supporting mobile driver's licenses, right, at airports. That is a credential issued to you by a central authority that you trust, that you can go carry it around like in your wallet, right? So you're not really declaring yourself a resident of Texas, for instance. You're allowing some other authority to do that. So a little bit of a misnomer. In terms of identity proofing, which is what that transition from physical to digital identity would be, there's a lot of organizations and vendors that actually try and provide solutions on that front. More interesting to me are standards that are emerging, such as the Global Assured Identity Network. This is a consortium of banks and other elements globally. And what they've done is they said, look, we've already got identity proofing set up. We've already got ways to prove who Mike Kaiser is in the real world and to be able to transfer that to the digital world. So let's go ahead and have those credentials, but share them in a standardized way. So now, because banks already take on that trust risk and everything else, you can get your credential from an authority like a bank and then use that as a portable identity or a component of a portable identity elsewhere. So the transition is important, and verifying, just like in facial recognition, kind of a proof of life and a liveness test, same kind of thing exists, but those challenges are being addressed by the community at large, as they should be, with government, businesses, and enterprises all involved in the discussion.
So Mike, is that a way of saying that, you guys do great with identity management inside an enterprise, but do you believe that there really is evolving, and is this another way of saying what you just said, a sort of ecosystem of identity management that's national or global that you can almost ultimately eventually plug into? So, I mean, it's an interesting issue for me. I wrote a book about Facebook, and I always say Facebook actually was the first identity authentication system on the internet. It was very crude, but it did work because whoever you allowed to be your friend were the people you allowed to see your information. But now we have much, much more sophisticated needs. And so it is becoming systematized. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that consumer enterprise identity is blurring. I think that you will, just like you have a wallet, a physical wallet with identification and credentials in it, you will have a digital wallet. And so what this means is that long-term, you will have statements about you, assertions about you issued by some authority, whether it's government or a bank or whoever else, that you carry around with you and say, look, this is who I am, just like a driver's license, except it'll be in digital format. That's the easiest way to talk about that, right? This has implications for enterprises in terms of bring your own identity. It's part of that identity context. It's not the only part, as Tony alluded to, right? What device are they coming from? Where are they located? All this kind of information influences the decision about whether or not they should be trusted to be who they claim to be.
Cool. Well, much more we could dig down there, I'm sure, because that's a very complex and rich topic. Tony, one of the interesting questions that Sandu Bershadsky asked was about crypto and why we're seeing so much crypto theft. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, because it's a very, pretty big question right now. We just hear it in the news all the time. Hey, this is supposed to be so secure in this landscape, but it's not, clearly.
Well, again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, the evolution of technology and the evolution of the attackers and their sophistication and their ability to identify weaknesses, right? And no longer are we, is it, a few folks trying to work on a problem. It's folks globally that are collaborating to identify the weaknesses in crypto and alike. And so, again, if you really spend some time, looking through, some of the research and things that folks do on this topic in general, you would be blown away by one, the education levels, the government sponsorships that are behind some of these activities. And I think just the general speed of analysis that happens today on something that's supposedly unbreakable, right? I mean, that's, we saw this with encryption algorithms years ago, right? And they continue to, that continued to evolve in terms of the next level of unbreakable. And I think it's the same situation here. It goes back to, collaboration from the bad guys and girls, goes back to sophistication in the analysis and the depth of the automation that they can do to get to the answer that they're looking for and find that weak link.
Yeah, that's not even getting into the issue of quantum computing.
I didn't even want to go there. That's a whole other scenario, right?
Really change the landscape and make it harder.
Sure.
Before I want to get a little later to this issue, one quick question later about state-sponsored, which you just hinted at, because one of the things that is so complicated now is you don't even know whether it's a private or public or state-sponsored attack. But I did make Esther Dyson able to talk if she's there. Could you go ahead and ask your interesting question about insurance?
So I'm just curious how insurance plays into all of this and the business model. I mean, it seems to me an insurance company, GM or somebody big, the market kind of works, but for a lot of smaller companies, it's simply understanding what kind of crypto services they've taken advantage of, who they've bought them from. If I were selling security, I would want to partner with an insurance company and say, hey, we'll lower your rates because we're going to make you much less of a risk. And that they should be some of the premier arbiters of who actually does a good job of it or not.
That's great. Tony, is that kind of thing going on?
It is in pockets, I would say. This kind of goes back to the third-party risk question. If you think about the standards boards that have been around in FS for years, and the next one that was going to come out was that's the standard. Now everybody can finally align on this, and then now we won't have 42 different questionnaires in terms of what we consider strong third-party risk. It's the same thing here. I mean, we've been approached by insurance organizations to say, can you create a framework and a methodology to do maturity assessments, right, of organizations, smaller organizations, and help us set the premium? right? And then if they are able to, to lower or increase their maturity, in essence, try to lower their vulnerability, maybe we could offer them, some lesser type of rate. And I think where those models have fallen down is what I described before, which is a lot of those risk assessments are so point in time that the insurance companies have they've stopped reliance on them as much to say, well, look, you were a maturity level 4, last week. Well, why all of a sudden are we getting breached, right? Well, that's because something's changed. So I don't see it as prevalent as I thought I was going to see it in terms of that linkage.
Yeah, I guess I would say that at some point, somebody needs, the market will work best not if the government sets standards, but rather if an insurance company is willing to put itself at risk because it sees the ability to get a better return by being very agile and kind of being part of that assessment process.
Yeah, this is such an interesting thing. I'd be curious if Mike or Elena have thoughts on it, this relationship with insurance.
David, we're probably in a different niche, but what I would say is that it's great that the models have matured. The ability to quantify those risks are now also more mature, and the data is available for those types of partnerships to even occur, which were not possible even a few years ago. Yeah, we probably just operate in a different niche, but it's great to see that it's possible.
There have been a lot of people who have been hell-bent on making cyber insurance a thing within the industry, right? I think at this point, from what I've seen, is that it's more focused, right? So for example, you wouldn't have insurance with regards to a breach, you would have insurance with a type of breach, like ransomware insurance caught on for half a year at least, right? Because of all the headlines. And so I think you'll probably see it in segments. But as the other panelists said, it's a shift of risk is what it is. How well can you assess risk? Are you willing to take it on? And we're back to the same issues we've been talking about with trust and how do you evaluate it and how do you establish it, right? Just from a different perspective. So it's a great question.
One thing I know all three of you are really interested in is this question between security and competitive advantage and innovation. Anybody want to jump in and talk about how you think about that? I mean, it really is, we obviously, if trust is a critical issue for customers, there's a way of talking about it that we've already addressed, but anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start just for a minute and let others chime in. I think, we talked a lot about the consumer earlier, but one thing I didn't mention, or we didn't mention as a group, is just how fast they can switch. Right. I mean, the stickiness between an organization and their consumers is different today than it ever has been before. That lack of stickiness, I should say. Right. I mean, if you're not happy with how an organization, whether that's their customer service line, whether that's the quality of their product, the services, or whether that's something, how they've communicated with you via a breach, incredibly easy to switch, right, to another provider, easier than it ever has been before. Organizations recognize that, right? There's whole groups of strategy folks within companies trying to figure out, how do I maintain that customer relationship? And they never used to talk about privacy or trust before. Elena referenced some surveys. There's been a number of great surveys around that have said, that that is directly tied to revenue increase, right? As it relates to companies that are able to demonstrate that level of trust, not only winning deals in bids, showcasing their programs, but also that it's for us, I've seen it more on the ongoing relationship management with the customer. And by the way, it's not just about we didn't have any breaches, right? I think that that is impossible, right? It's how did we communicate with the customer? How proactive were we on this? How did we give them whatever we needed to give them in terms of comfort levels, whether that's credit monitoring, whether that's making sure their accounts were restored, anything like that. I think even the consumer knows, that this is, not an if, it's when scenario, but so many organizations have failed in the communication and of when things happen, how do they communicate, not only with regulators, which, they're forced to do now, but with consumers as well. I think that is as important to the consumer as anything else to continue to build that trust.
Yep. David, I would add to that that new technology inevitably creates new risks. And on the other hand, new risks inevitably create opportunities for innovation. Just in the last 2 years during the pandemic, we saw how so many businesses have transformed themselves at the speed that was just unthinkable before. We also saw at the same time an entire shift in perception of cybersecurity. That it used to be perceived as potential hindrance of innovation or potentially, sayer, but I don't think that's the case anymore. We really do see more and more process changes where security is embedded from the beginning, from the design. On the flip side, I think when we talk about security and innovation, it really ties back into the talent question that you raised earlier. For us to unleash more innovation, we have to source talent from new places. We have to give people opportunities to be able to do so and show their creativity and show their innovative side. As managers, I believe it's important that we raise the bar and sometimes, our teams may really surprise us in a very positive way as to what they can do and what ideas they can come up with.
Yeah, I don't know as much about Sailpoint, but I know SAP and Wipro both are really good at that, finding talent wherever it lies. Mike, I wanted to go to you. Going back to this automation point, I have in my list of questions, real-time monitoring and response. We haven't talked as much about the response. Like I was curious. Say in your identity architecture, you discover that somebody is in there that shouldn't be. What happens then? And I guess I'd love anybody to comment on, if we're talking about automation in security, it's not just about automating the protections, it's about automating the response when a breach occurs. So Mike, first you, and then anybody who wants to jump in.
Sure. I think there's a danger, especially if you walk the halls of major cybersecurity conferences and the expo rooms, to have vendors yell at you and say, well, if you just had our solution or our offering, you'd be fine. And that's never true, right? I picture this as a team sport, so that no one solution, no one offering is going to be able to do that in real time. Because the fact of the matter is, there are always silos of information throughout your enterprise, throughout your infrastructure. I'm a huge fan of some emerging standards that have people work together. For example, the emerging standard called shared signals. And what that does is anytime anyone detects anything that's wrong, anything that's compromised, you send out via PubSub, you send out a signal to every other component that wants to hear, which is brilliant, because now we're bridging this gap between these siloed vendors or even siloed infrastructure. If Sailpoint detects something that's wrong in an identity context, we can send that out, and now they're locked out of AD. We can take some of those actions, but moving to real time, killing a session in a firewall, killing a session, access to email in as close to real time as possible is going to be more and more essential, because the amount of time that it takes you to respond is time they can have to do malicious activities. So that's a goal, keep in mind, right? That's an emerging standard, but I'm really encouraged by that kind of teamwork and collaboration rather than fighting for market share or whatever else there is.
Yeah. One of the things that really amazed me in all the commentary about SolarWinds, though, was that companies weren't even able to figure out whether they had been hacked, or they knew that it had happened, but they didn't know if the people were still getting access to their data. I found that sort of shocking, that it's still very difficult for many companies even to determine whether an incident that they've identified is still underway.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say, back that up even further to, how many organizations feel really good about their CMDB right now and their ability to actually
What's that acronym
understand
stand for? Wait.
the configuration management database. So what does the landscape of their IT environment look like? How many organizations are confidently sitting here saying, I understand, all of my assets, right? Where they live, who's responsible for them, what patch level they're at. No way, right? So that's part of, so it's not just, what you described. I would back up the chain even further and say, that our ability to get a better handle on the landscape through discovery and further, this intelligence that we've been talking about to continually learn is step one in terms of understanding what do we've got. I mean, it's typically patching these vulnerabilities isn't really that hard. It's the project management, the program management, the change management to understand what needs to be patched and how can I actually, get this tested and done within the windows that are not going to disrupt business. I mean, that's good old fashioned, change management 101, but it heightens what happens is everybody gets into this spin cycle from a prioritization standpoint when these types of breaches or activities occur. So I think, the
what I
point there,
would,
David, is there's some foundational elements. I think
Yeah.
that we're still getting as an industry, we're still tackling.
yeah, and I was going to tack on there, Tony, that ironically, one of the first things I would do if I owned a business, outside of setting up security and the infrastructure and approaching it that way, is I would hire a good PR messaging firm, because it's always going to be a challenge to keep up. And so, like we said before, communicating well to the outside world. And you can see this in tying it back into cyber insurance and some of these other issues. People are marketing integrity with people's data. People are marketing integrity, doing the right thing with identity and with privacy and everything else. But CES companies saying what happens on your phone stays on your phone, for instance, right? That's a new wave in the cybersecurity industry, which is fascinating, that customers are going to expect ethics.
Okay, I said we would talk about state-sponsored hacking, and we don't really have time, but I'll just say one thing to cover that. SolarWinds was probably the Russians, so that's enough to say there. But we got a great question about talent and cybersecurity talent and how we can grow the talent of the future. I don't know if Elena, you want to comment on what, SAP is a great company for thinking about people and talent. You're such a giant global company, but maybe anybody else wants to take that too. So Elena, and then anybody else.
Absolutely, David. I think, talent is critical to any kind of innovation or growth and development. And, in cybersecurity has been a sector where there was traditionally a perception that, we just don't have enough talent to hire from. So we have to be creative into where we source that talent from, definitely providing cross training, providing opportunities to people from other disciplines and fields. We, for instance, have established new partnerships with schools, universities, colleges, where we start early, where we hire from, talent and that we develop and grow internally. And I think this is, just those kind of approaches, sourcing from unexpected sources, providing more opportunities, are really the key to fill those huge job gaps that are being reported in our industry. And it's going to stay competitive for a while.
Yeah. Any quick thoughts from the other two of you?
Well, I think that the key thing, you're looking for a unicorn. I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, we call those folks cybersecurists, and the reason that we call them that is because it's not just about technical depth and expertise and vendor certifications, but it's also about understanding the business processes, right? And the industry context around it, and the fact that there's a higher purpose to all this stuff. That's a lot, to put into an individual, right? So we have, these 6 weeks onboarding boot camp for campus grads. We have obviously lateral training that happens, vendor certifications that training that happen. Elena talked about cross training, cross skilling, and so forth. Never seems to be enough, right? We're still looking for creative ways to kind of go after that. But I just think it's critical for all of us to make sure that we invest in our people, in our organizations, and make sure that they understand how they can have a long and fruitful career with each of our, which means meaningful work, right? And it also means that we have, they continue to develop themselves personally and professionally. Yeah.
There's also pre-work to be done, I think, also, that as an industry, because we are financially very viable, it's incumbent upon us to go where people are underrepresented or do not have as much opportunity to embrace technology, and go and invest in those populations and those people groups so that they will feel empowered and enabled. And that's a long play, but that's also, it's kind of what I think what Elena was hinting at in terms of untapped resources as well, that enabling people on technology, giving them education early on so they embrace it as an option going forward.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're over our time. You guys have been great. We didn't even really get a chance to ask Mike why he doesn't have a white hat. But in any case, somebody in the chat sort of hinted at that, or we got it. I love that we had some nice, pleasant, non-security related comments and questions there. And we even are getting good questions as we finish from Tanya, which we don't have time for, but thank you, all three of you. Thank you so much to Wipro for partnering on this session. And we will be putting up more about this session, and the video will be hosted on Techonomy's website if you know anybody who missed it and wants to see it again. So thank you again. And we will no doubt revisit this topic before too long. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Cheers, thanks.